step to introduce you and then let you have this back momentarily. Ready? Welcome, friends in the room and live via AirMeet to the 2025 Barth Conference on the Incarcerated God. This is our first of our concurrent sessions. We will hear a couple of papers. I will introduce each of our presenters before their respective papers, and then hopefully we will have a little time for some Q&A. Thanks for coming out. This should be exciting. We have flipped the order a little bit to call the audible on some AV audio technical issues. So we will begin with Rebekah Schultz. Rebekah Schultz is a PhD student in religious studies at the University of Virginia. She has a BA in both theology and studio art. Now that's a combination. And an MTS from Duke Divinity School with a certificate in theology and the arts. Rebekah loves exploring how art functions as prayer for both artists and audiences, creating space for communal reflection, lament, and hope. Man, we need some of that, huh? Her research focuses on theology and aesthetics, and she is particularly interested in protest art made during the time of the COVID pandemic. So, without further ado, Rebekah, please.
Art created by incarcerated people functions as an act of embodied prayer and resistance, aligning with Karl Barth's theology of prayer as both freedom before God and necessary response to injustice. Barth argues that Christians are called to revolt against the godless powers of oppression, understanding this resistance as an act of prayer. There we go. Okay. So Barth says, quote, "The decisive action of their revolt against disorder, which correctly understood includes within itself all others, is their calling upon God in the second petition of the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come." End quote. If prayer is both a freedom and a call to action, then carceral art, created despite systemic confinement, is a prayer of resistance. Sorry, there's a lot of slides. Taking the art of Russell Craig as a case study, I will argue that artwork made by incarcerated artists asserts their dignity against the dehumanization of the prison industrial complex and exemplifies Barth's call to resistance against the powers of systemic oppression. Through letters, poetry, and visual art, incarcerated artists reclaim their time, space, and agency, refusing to be silenced by the penal system. In analyzing such artwork made in prison or after the artist's release, I draw on Nicole Fleetwood's concept of carceral aesthetics, which is defined as, quote, "forms of art making and cultural engagement that take place across various states of unfreedom produced in the era of mass incarceration." And in Marking Time, Art in the Age of Mass Incarceration, Nicole Fleetwood highlights the ways that incarcerated artists, under oppressive surveillance, work with limited access to materials and time. They often risk further punishment, censorship, or the destruction of their work. Yet their persistence in creating, especially art that represents or critiques the prison system, is a way to resist structures of captivity and to share their voice with others outside the prison walls. Like Barth's vision of prayer as an urgent, embodied response, carceral art exposes injustice while imagining liberation. Go to the next slide. But what does it mean to call art an embodied act of prayer and a practice of freedom? What do we mean when we use the word prayer? In his Church Dogmatics, Karl Barth writes that, quote, "the real basis of prayer is our freedom before God. The God-given permission to prayer, which because it is given by God, becomes a command and an order and therefore a necessity." End quote. Barth emphasizes that God gives us the freedom to participate in God's work in the world and to respond through our prayers. It is an act of both dependence and agency, bringing our questions, griefs, and hopes before God, while also stepping into the responsibility of caring for our community. Writing about Barth's definition of prayer, Daniel L. Miore states that, quote, "the freedom to pray includes the freedom to petition, to praise, to confess, to intercede. It also includes the freedom to cry out and protest against the continuing presence of injustice, violence, and oppression in the world. This freedom to pray is not limited to our words, but extends to our bodies and our actions." For incarcerated people whose very freedom is legally stripped away from them, art can become such an act of prayer. Art made in either sanctioned prison studios or more covertly in cells can create space for the imprisoned artists to make their own choices regarding the art, and to have some freedom and agency over the piece, which they do not have anywhere else. It also provides a way for artists to process their emotions, protests, desires, and hopes as they grapple with life behind bars. Through their work, artists claim the dignity and worth of themselves and those incarcerated with them, and resist unjust systems of power which disproportionately imprison and punish people of color. Then, Russell Craig is one such artist who developed his skill painting techniques in prison and continues to use his art now to advocate against mass incarceration. Craig, who grew up in the foster system, did not have access to outside financial support while incarcerated, and so he began painting portraits and other art pieces commissioned by fellow inmates or prison staff in exchange for money or art materials. Creating art allowed him to build a network of relationships, as well as to support his own artistic projects, which call attention to and critique the prison industrial complex. Speaking about his time in prison, Craig states that, quote, art became more than just a hobby. It became a way out of something impressive, end quote. Since his release, Craig's paintings and mixed media works have received national attention and have been shown in various high-profile exhibits, including the Brooklyn Museum, MoMA PS1, Philadelphia Magic Gardens, and Columbia University's Justice Lab. Though Craig's art is not explicitly religious, I argue that it can be read as prayer because it embodies the hopes, laments, joys, petitions, and protests of Craig and the incarcerated community, creating a way forward and joining the struggle against oppression that we are fighting. Go to the next slide. Discussing our call to resist oppression, Barth ties his theology of prayer to ethics by arguing that our prayers must be lived out through public action and response to injustice. What he calls, quote, a struggle that Christians cannot avoid, a revolt that is both permitted and also commanded, end quote. This revolt against the lordless powers of oppression and disorder is crucial to both prayer and the Christian life. As we are called to pray, thy kingdom come, we are also called to enact and to work towards God's kingdom by resisting and fighting against anything that harms human relationships with God or with one another, such as systems of injustice, oppression, and disorder. Prayer in this way is inseparable from our specific political and ethical locations. Ashley Coxworth makes this point in his book, Karl Barth on Prayer, when he writes that, quote, because prayer gets to the very heart of issues of power relations and the complex ways in which the divine and human can be said to exercise power, the practice of prayer itself is an unavoidably and fundamentally political event. In the same way, cultural art is inherently political. When artists work to create art within the prison system, their time, materials, space, and the content of their art can be regulated or confiscated at any moment. Incarcerated artists also wrestle with the fact that their bodies, and thus anything they create, can be considered state property, and they may have to leave artwork behind when they are released. By continuing to create despite the risk of further punishment, incarcerated artists resist the loss of agency and power that the prison industrial complex has claimed. Next slide. In response to media narratives about those who are incarcerated as violent or terrible people, Nicole Fleetwood highlights the creation of portraits as one significant way of reclaiming dignity and humanity, writing that, quote, through portraiture, the imprisoned claim the right not only to look, but also to represent themselves and others, end quote. In Russell Craig's self-portrait, titled State ID, made in 2013, Craig asserts his identity as both prisoner and artist by painting an image of his prison ID card and underscoring the word art found within the official Department of Corrections. In an interview about the piece, Craig also points to his inmate number, which takes up a large portion of the PP, saying that, quote, when you go to prison, you become that number. My identity, who I was, didn't matter. You become like an item, like property. I wanted to bring that to people's attention, end quote. Through this piece, Craig highlights the dehumanization of the prison system and calls the viewer to resist by acknowledging his personhood and dignity. Next. Like our current prison system, the powers of disorder cause us to dehumanize one another and to compete against one another, to the point of destroying ourselves or others in the process. However, the lordless powers are not truly substantial on their own, but are things or ways that we misuse our freedom, that turn us against our neighbors and cause harm to others. Barth names such powers as money, resources, ideologies, technology, power, political systems, and constructs. All things that are not inherently evil, but which can be incredibly destructive if we let them rule us. Through our idealization and worship of these powers, they erase our human dignity, end quote. They oppress people. They move them according to the laws of their own dynamics and mechanics. They make them subjects, parrots, puppets, or even robots. In so doing, they afflict and oppress and harass them. Under their lordship, people necessarily become people of disorder. End quote. Though Barth calls such powers lordless, he is also careful to note that they are not beyond God's control. God created them as good things for us, but like us, the powers rebel against God, twisting good into evil. Ashley Coxworth notes that we are not to be afraid of these powers, but rather are called to resist them. If the unruly this is a quote. If the unruly lordless powers are that which we each somehow perversely and absurdly will or infuse with relative, though unfounded significance, then the onus of the responsibility for the revolt against these powers also falls on us. Thus we are called to revolt against these powers of disorder, which create oppression and injustice, joining the fight to bring God's kingdom of order, justice, and right relationship to earth. Incarcerated artists know well the harms of powers like the prison industrial complex, systemic racism, the school-to-prison pipeline, and barriers to re-entry, such as the perfectly legal ways to discriminate against those with prison record. Carceral art revolts against these powers, calling attention to these harmful systems and striving for change. This is precisely the case in another portrait by Russell Craig that was part of an installation titled Truth to Power at the Philadelphia African American Museum. The 2016 exhibit, held just a few blocks away from the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, was put on by a nonpartisan organization called Rock the Vote, and was designed to draw attention to various weather issues such as immigration reform, gun violence, and mass incarceration. Craig's self-portrait for the show was painted on his legal documents from prison and the halfway house he stayed in after his release. Stretching 8 feet high and 8 feet across, the piece takes up significant space and is made up of 4 canvases placed together, with his paperwork overlaid and the pastel portrait on top. Next slide. Speaking about the portrait, Craig states, quote, "I wanted to place myself within the 4 different canvases, so the separation would be like crosshairs, like being targeted." End quote. Here Craig calls out the injustice of mass incarceration and the ways that Black bodies are treated like threats that must be controlled. His art acts as a prayer of revolt against the unjust systems of power, calling the viewer to resist and to acknowledge who benefits from these systems and who is harmed by them, calling us to resist and to work toward a different future. For Barth, this revolt against the lawless powers takes place not only on an individual level, but also on a communal level. Individuals are called to turn away from destruction and to use their own freedom and agency to care for their neighbors, and to pray for God's kingdom through their words and actions. But more than just individual ethical decisions, this revolt means no longer participating in societal systems of oppression, and instead actively working to dismantle unjust structures. Just as the powers of oppression do not only show up in individual interactions, but also within communities, laws, and systems, revolt against the powers, then, must take place communally and structurally. Barth distinguishes this revolt against the powers of oppression from any other personal, societal, or national revolt by arguing that our revolt is not against other people. The powers themselves are inhuman, and they cause harm to us and to our neighbors. Barth writes that, quote, "As the powers tear apart the individual, so they tear apart society also. Giving rights to no one, they make it impossible for any to grant mutual rights." End quote. Thus, our fight against the powers is also a fight on behalf of one another. So as we are called to revolt against these powers, we must also create new ways and systems that honor the human dignity and image of God in others, fighting for the people around us. Next slide. While in prison, Craig connected with Mural Arts Philadelphia, a nonprofit that runs art programming in prisons and employs artists who have been incarcerated or recently released on parole. After his release, Craig went through their Restorative Justice Guild program, which supports re-entry by providing employment on mural arts projects and workshops on career skills for a 5-month period. Craig continued working as a teaching assistant with mural arts after he graduated from the Guild. In 2018, Craig painted the windows of the Municipal Services Building in downtown Philadelphia with portraits of the Restorative Justice Guild's 2018 cohort. Titled Portraits of Justice, the 17 large-scale portraits were designed in collaboration with another formerly incarcerated artist, Jesse Crimes, and funded by Mural Arts and several other government and non-profit organizations. Each person is painted in front of a brick background, which, quote, "symbolizes the systems that create barriers to re-entry," End quote. Designed to catch the viewer's eye, these portraits radiate strength and dignity as the subjects stare back at the audience, demanding that their worth be recognized. In describing the installation, mural art states that, quote, these larger-than-life portraits remind all who see them that formerly incarcerated individuals are valuable human beings with rich, complex lives and the capacity for change, not problems to be solved. End quote. In this way, these portraits resist the lawless powers by claiming the humanity of those at the margin. They draw attention to the importance of community and solidarity, as well as pointing out the work yet to be done. Next slide. Like each portrait, our acts of revolt against the oppressive powers are not designed to stand on our own. Each act, each image is crucial, but they join a larger resistance. Barth places significant responsibility on humans as ethical agents who are called to pray for God's kingdom and to resist the lordless powers. However, we are joining a war that has already begun and which we cannot finish. God has already declared victory over the powers of this world in the death and resurrection of Christ. And God will ultimately destroy anything that separates us from God and from one another, bringing God's kingdom to earth. In Barth's words, quote, the overthrow of the regime cannot be an affair of our own action. That God himself will overthrow it is what we pray for. But to rise up in rebellion against the regime, that is something that is humanly possible. End quote. Through our invocation of God and our resistance against the lawless powers, Ashley Coxworth notes that our revolt becomes, quote, an entering into the divine revolt that is already underway. End quote. Though God is the one who will ultimately destroy the powers of oppression, this does not mean that we sit by and wait. Instead, we must join in rebelling and fighting injustice in this moment, so that we may hasten the kingdom coming. Next slide. Art created by incarcerated people resists injustice here and now. In 2020, the U.S. saw a significant rise in Black Lives Matter protests and activism in response to the deaths of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and countless others. Those incarcerated at the time were excluded from society, but were not excluded from the cultural moment, nor from the effects of systemic racism and biased sentencing policies. For those whose freedom to march and protest is taken from them, art provides a way to respond and to join in protest. Through his art, Craig joins the fight against the powers of oppression, calling attention to issues of mass incarceration and the worth of Black lives outside of prison as well. Craig has been active in the Black Lives Matter movement since his release from prison in 2013. In 2016, he painted a portrait of Eric Garner on a canvas overlaid with cigarette packs that Craig found while walking around the streets of Philadelphia. In another work, black canvases surround a central portrait of Aiyana Jones, representing the deaths of Black people killed by the police. Some canvases are larger to represent the media attention that their deaths receive, while the smaller canvases represent those killed whose stories don't make it into the news, including one main neighborhood. Next slide. In 2020, Craig painted portraits of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery as part of his work with the Art for Justice Fund, which provided grant funding to support artistic projects and advocacy against mass incarceration. Craig's portrait of Breonna Taylor was shown at an exhibit held by the New York Civil Liberties Union in 2023. Titled 29 Million Dreams, the exhibit reflected on the $29 million that New York City spends on policing each year. Each of Craig's paintings resists the lawless powers, fighting for Black lives, worth, and dignity. One painting will not end police brutality, but it is an important act of naming the powers of oppression and systemic racism as evil and calling for resistance. One painting will not end police brutality, but together thousands can make a difference. If we take seriously Barth's claim that revolt against the lawless powers is a central act of prayer, then we must recognize carceral art as theologically significant. As prayer, it is both free response and revolt against the oppressive powers, an embodied witness to justice, hope, and liberation. As prayer, carceral art is costly when imprisoned artists defy the constraints of the prison system, risking much to transform the limited resources available to them into spaces of protest and refuge. As prayer, this art joins a resistance that has already begun and finds power in communal rebellion and reimagining. As prayer, carceral art demands transformation. Thank you.
Next up, we have Dr. John Hardie, who served for 25 years as a campus minister and pastor. Along the way on that journey, he did an STM at Yale and PhD here at Princeton Theological Seminary. For the past 7 years, he's taught English literature and coached football back at his high school south of Atlanta, back in my area of the country. If you haven't been able to tell, every once in a while it slips through. You can tell I'm not from here. In 2021, Dr. Hardie created Praxis, a 501c3 nonprofit to help love on the young people that he serves. That's the official. Unofficially, also, I'm glad to introduce Dr. Hardie, who he and I have been corresponding online now for, I think, 4 years. I just checked, going all the way back to 2021, and some online spaces about theology, evangelicalism, this kind of stuff. And this is actually the first time we're meeting in person after knowing each other for 4 years online. So I'm thrilled to introduce him. Please, Dr. Hardie, welcome.
I gave you a paper there. We won't get through all this, but we'll get through some of it. I'll read different parts of it, and we'll have fun. And as I tell my students, this is the most important class you're ever going to take. This is what I tell them, especially when we're talking about Baldwin, about love. So hopefully I'll speak to you. Take the first page. Looking Through Glass, a conversation between Karl Barth and James Baldwin on the school to prison pipeline. Then this line from Tish Rivers, the narrator, If Beale Street Could Talk. I hope that nobody has ever had to look at anybody they love through glass. What kind of theology is needed to anchor and motivate enduring love? What theological convictions sustain the ethics of emotion one finds in James Baldwin's writings? This paper responds to these questions by drawing on sources framed by the unlikeliest of conversation partners, an intertextual reading of Barth's Theology of Prophetic Witness from Church Dogmatics 4.3, and Baldwin's 1974 novella, If Beale Street Could Talk. Bringing Barth to Baldwin and Baldwin to Barth, one encounters not merely an impassioned plea, but also the kind of Christological motivation for the Christian church in America to dare to love as our incarcerated God loves. What if the Christian church in America dared, as Baldwin suggested in his 1982 letter to prisoners, to see the other as oneself? What if love focused on disrupting the school to prison pipeline, despite all of its dismal socioeconomic entanglements? Reading If Beale Street, I forgot to start my time. Sure, we get that. Reading If Beale Street Could Talk with his other nonfiction essays, including his 1982 letter to prisoners, Baldwin's writings become a site for a theological voice uttering a plea to exchange monstrous indifference for Barth's prophetic witness. This juxtaposition of plea and witness are already concentrated in Baldwin's writings, as well as his plenary address to the World Council of Churches, 1968. That's going to be a big thing. There, Baldwin invoked a plea framed in the words of the incarcerated God. The plea was articulated by Jesus Christ himself, who said, "Insofar as you have done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me." And here in this paper, as in Baldwin's World Council of Churches address, that plea stands as a reminder of the Christian call to take our places with that criminal. Those are Baldwin's words. So here's what I'd like you to do is take the next page. I cannot have a presentation on Baldwin. These guys did have something else in common than just being on the front cover of Time magazine. Barth was in 1962, and then Baldwin was in 1963. Barth did read Baldwin. This made my day when Raymond Carr, some of y'all know Ray Carr, just wrote a 3-volume work. He took this picture when he was in Basel. When I was in Basel, I went through Barth's library trying to see everything he had written on the book of what he read on the book of Job, and if he'd made comments. This was 2005 when I was in Basel. My friend Ray Carr was there, took the pictures. I said, "Man, did you open them? Like, did you look and see what were the annotations, or take some pictures?" But he tells me they were very much annotated. Here's what this means: is Nobody Knows My Name is a book that Martin Luther King Jr. actually wrote a letter to Baldwin about to say thank you for what you did. he writes his 20-page essay about King. This is 1961. So Nobody Knows My Name is 1961. Another Country comes out. That's Baldwin's third novel. And that one comes out in 1962. Okay, so Barth could have picked up both Nobody Knows My Name and Another Country when he was here in 1962. That makes a lot of sense, right? But The Fire Next Time comes out in 1963. 1963, right? He's back in Basel, so he either ordered the book or somebody sent it to him, right? So he took pains to get, is my point. And then in October of 1963, he actually mentions he's been reading Baldwin. And so this is from the letters, in which he mentions his own reading of the Black writer James Baldwin. So if you put this together, Barth is reading Baldwin when he's at least 77 years old. All right? That's encouraging to me more than I can tell you. Baldwin, how I got into Baldwin was 2015, I was doing something at Princeton University and started reading Eddie Glaude's book, In a Shade of Blue. And what I kept seeing were all these quotes from this guy named James Baldwin. I remember Cornel West had mentioned James Baldwin, but I had never read James Baldwin. So I didn't start reading James Baldwin until I was maybe 40 years old, I guess. And now I have so much fun with my students doing this. One of the most significant lines that I use, this comes from an essay entitled The Creative Process. He says this: if we understood ourselves better, we would damage ourselves less. Now, notice this is not a focus on just the individual. Sometimes Baldwin's used a lot these days. Sometimes what people use him to say is we need individuals to feel free and loved. Actually, he has this sense of I can't understand who I am without you. And so notice the emphasis upon third person here. If we understood ourselves, we third person, ourselves third person, better, we third person would, first person plural, I'm sorry, first person, we would damage ourselves less. So the point is there is a collective sense in which this is true for Baldwin, and he emphasizes that just as much as he does any type of self-awareness that we might need. I've given you a couple quotes on page 2. I can't talk about Baldwin without having you hear his voice. So here's from a video that was made in Paris in 1971, Meeting the Man, James Baldwin in Paris. And it looks like we don't have it here. Shit. Again. That's okay. We don't have it. Take this out. What's gonna happen?
Well,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, we'll go with that. We'll go with that. No problem. Okay. So bottom line is, look, I've given you, especially this is one of the reasons why I wanted to hand you a paper, is that if you look on the next page, what you're going to see is everything that I've done, everything that I have. Go back to the first page. I'm sorry. If you look at the footnote there, you'll see this is Baldwin's full address. So what happens is King gets assassinated April 4th, 1968. King was scheduled to speak before the World Council of Churches July 7, 1968. So they get Baldwin to fill in for him. Baldwin there gives an address that you have to listen to. You can read it in the volume that's Baldwin's collected essays that Toni Morrison edited. There are a couple of mistakes. Actually, in my essay, I correct one of them. But he is just an amazing address. So here's what I like to do with the rest of my time is take this novel, If Beale Street Could Talk, and show you how one of the characters, the most religious one, who's also the least loving one, Fonnie Hunt's mother, she's the most religious one, but she's a self-righteous, judgmental type person. How what Baldwin is doing there is he's using in a novel, right? He's fictionalized in this one character what he accuses the church of being, which is not a place where he found love. So if you take your sheet, paper, page 3, told through the eyes of 19-year-old Tish Rivers, If Beale Street Could Talk, is a love story. But it's a love story problematized by a criminal justice system that Baldwin considered oppressive, exercising what he called, quote, a criminal power. I gave you that later too. That's a line from The Fire Next Time, 1963. Narrated through the eyes of Tish, 19-year-old young woman who's in love with Fonnie, a young artist, very apropos for previous paper. Fonnie's a young artist. He's a sculptor who has been arrested and falsely accused of a horrible crime. Juxtaposition of two families. Baldwin's story brings to life two characters representing a portrait of Black familial love that calls to account the loveless judgmentalism of the Hunt household, in particular, Mrs. Hunt, okay, Fonnie's mother. An example, by the way, let me just ask, how many of y'all have read Beale Street Could Talk? How many of y'all have seen the movie? No? Oh, gosh, okay. Look, so what you've got is Barry Jenkins, who also produced Moonlight. In 2018, he produces If Beale Street Could Talk. Now, this was actually something that Baldwin had wanted. Here's a letter from Baldwin to his older brother saying, hey, I've got this deal with this French film producer to put Beale Street make it into a film. So I have no doubt that Baldwin was excited that Barry Jenkins put this together. But it's a phenomenal film. Regina King plays Sharon Rivers, who is Tish's, the pregnant 19-year-old young woman. Her mother is the portrait of love. In contrast, juxtaposed with Mrs. Hunt, who is Fonnie's mother, and she is as judgmental and as self-righteous as you could possibly be. In a sense, she's exactly what Baldwin accuses the Christian church of being in 1968. So that's enough of that. Let's skip over to page 4. James at the very top. James Baldwin has often been called prescient, being able to see in the future. And on the matter of mass incarceration in the U.S., he certainly raised his voice of conscience to the nation when we were on the verge of that enormous explosion of incarcerated African-American males. Baldwin's novel, If Beale Street Could Talk, tells the story of the horrifying injustices experienced by Fonnie, forced to deal with false charges made up by a white police officer in the context of a criminal justice system roiling in the trappings of white supremacy and the kind of justice that one can come to expect for the poor. One of the repeated lines is the poor are always crossing the Sahara. So this creates complications, right? How do they get an attorney? They can't post bail for Fonnie, et cetera, et cetera. In the middle of the page 4, Baldwin on Law as Criminal Power in Beale Street. The book on Baldwin and the court system and jail and prison is this book written by Quentin Miller, entitled A Criminal Power. A criminal power is a phrase, again, that Baldwin uses in The Fire Next Time. Baldwin on Law as Criminal Power in Beale Street. In works like No Name in the Street and The Devil Finds Work, Baldwin characterizes prisons as instruments of racial and social control. For Baldwin, prisons were not just places of punishment, but reflections of America's moral and political failures, part of a broader system designed to maintain white supremacy and suppress dissent. In Beale Street, Fonnie finds himself disoriented with his back against the wall because of a, quote, criminal power exerted by the entire criminal justice system as a whole, starting with the police corruption of Officer Bell. He's one of the only 2 white characters in the story. All the way through to the continued delay of his trial to his eventual implied taking a plea deal. Seen especially in the corrupt Officer Bell, who frames Fonnie, Baldwin's fictional story is both a fictionalized version of his plenary address to the World Council of Churches, demonstrating the failure to love by the story's primary religious character, Mrs. Hunt. Primary religious character is also the least loving character in the story. But Beale Street also places on public display Baldwin's considered judgment regarding the dehumanizing oppression foisted upon persons by the criminal justice system. Daniel, the closest friend of Fonnie in the novel, reveals the suffering he endured while incarcerated for 2 years, seriously traumatized by the experience. Daniel's experience revealed to Fonnie, Daniel's experience that he shares with Fonnie, reveals to Fonnie, sets in place the expectations of the reader for what Fonnie is sure to endure while imprisoned as well. As soon as he has that conversation, the door comes that night police come to the door that night to arrest Fonnie. Baldwin creates two characters, both black males, whose experience of prison is on display, so that in the context of the story, Tish's repeated observation comes across loud and clear. The poor are always crossing the Sahara. Baldwin's contention is unmistakable. One gets the justice one can afford. Now, the context of looking through glass was Tish's response to what she verbalized after she left the prison where she had seen Fonnie through glass. Let me give you just brief context from my looking through glass. On Wednesday, I looked through glass towards one of my former students, my very first year teaching back in my old high school. And 7 years ago, he is now 23. He's been charged with murder. He's been in jail for 3 years. He still has not gotten a plea deal sentencing. His sentencing is not for another 3 months. And the part of the problem is the prosecutor knows he didn't intend to kill the person. It's more should be some kind of involuntary homicide kind of charge. But the problem is the prosecutor wants him to roll over on all the other guys he was with. So it was gang related, right? The problem is one of the other guys who was in that very first class that I taught, one of my students, Raheem, this student, Ray, did roll over. And when he got sent to the real prison where he was going to spend time, the more serious prison, immediately he was attacked and stabbed, almost died. So this particular student, who I'll call Daniel, not his real name, Daniel doesn't want to go through all of it. Now, that is the context in which I'm thinking about this phrase, looking through glass at someone you love. And what I'm trying to say is there is a whole generation of young folks who are endangered right now, and we've got to care. Now, let me skip a great deal, but let me point out on page 5, the middle paragraph there at the bottom. From whence comes such criticism of the criminal justice system in the U.S.? Well, first, it should be pointed out, Baldwin did not simply criticize the prison system in the United States. After spending 8 days in a French jail himself for a minor offense, he actually received a guy stole a bed sheet from a hotel and gave it to Baldwin. Baldwin gets arrested, spends 8 days in this disgusting French jail. He comes back to his hotel, he makes it into a noose, gets up on a chair, puts it around his neck. He's 25 years old, jumps off. It's his failed attempt at suicide, which one of his biographers, David Lemming, described as being rebaptized by the flood. The water pipe broke, that he tied the sheet to. So where is all this going? Look on page 6. I'll wrap up with this, and then we'll do some questions. So Baldwin's critique of the church is basically the church does not love. If you look at the middle section, part of the dilemma, the very middle quote in the middle of page 6, Baldwin was criticizing the church because the church opted for power over love. Quote, part of the dilemma of the Christian church is the fact that it opted, in fact, for power and betrayed its own first principles, which were its responsibility to every living soul, the assumption of which the Christian church's basis, as I understand it, is that all men are the sons of God and that all men are free in the eyes of God. And the dictum, the commandment given to the Christian church was, love one another as I have loved you. Baldwin continues his criticism, pointing to the danger of the Christian church. The danger of the Christian church is it's not merely because black people say it is, but because people are always in great danger when they know what they should do and refuse to act on what they know. Baldwin ends this, turn to page 7, that last section there. Baldwin ends his address invoking the plea. Again, a plea that he's saying. In fact, in the introduction, the plea is this. He says, in the heart of this absolutely necessary accusation. If you call me on the phone and say, John, I got an absolutely necessary accusation to bring to you, I'm going to say, okay. Baldwin says, in the midst of his absolutely necessary accusation against the Christian church, there is a plea. The plea is that you start to love people, right? And so if the Christian church does not, this is how he ends, if the Christian church does not recover its Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, we shall discover the meaning of what he meant when he said, insofar as you've done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. He gives this scathing, excoriating criticism of all these folk, 740 folks, 245 different branches of the Christian church, and they give this enormous applause. That was one of the things I was going to play for you. Their applause is so thunderous, you can't imagine getting poked in the eye more by this absolutely necessary accusation. But I got a plea to tell you, you need to start loving. And sure enough, that's the response. In a sense, the church is representative of what Baldwin calls moral monsters over and over again. I've given you some quotes here. You can look at those things. Turn to page 11 just real quick. What I would say is what happens with Baldwin, and if there is a connection to make with Barth, which one of the things I did not want to do is say, hey, how did they actually work together? What I wanted to say was there's an aspect in which Baldwin needs Barth. And what I think he needs Barth on has to do with theology of prophetic witness. And what I mean by this is Barth's understanding of evil as das Nichtige, right? In Church Dogmatics 3:3, that it actually has been overcome. It already has been defeated. In paragraph 72, the sending of the Christian church into the world, sending the Christian community into the world, he talks there about prophetic witness against das Nichtige, that we are to say what is true about it. Barth got himself into trouble, I think, with the confusing ontological language of nothingness, right? Das Nichtige. But if you were to read that as an ethical judgment, in other words, this is an ethical judgment upon evil that happens at the cross in the person, in the event of Christ. And what happens there is that God says a no, hell no. I'm not making any peace treaty with evil. If that is what Barth is trying to get at with this notion, which I think is what it is, it's ethical reading of evil, then Baldwin's example of prophetic witness in the face of evil, I have to ask myself the question, is that not what we would want to see someone do? In other words, you can't understand Baldwin apart from his prophetic witness against the evil that he sees. And it's one of the reasons why he was dismissed as such an angry black man. But it's because of his commitment. I will not make a peace treaty with evil. And I do think there's place there. If you look on page 12, you can see that. At the end of the day, we're looking through glass. Look, seeing through glass or shattering the glass. Okay. I'll end with the skip to the very last part of page 13. Will we ever do the above if we refuse? I've given 5 things about the prison, school to prison pipeline here, what I would love to see the church care about and give a damn about. I think that's the real problem. And I'm not talking about the black church tradition. I was baptized into the black church tradition when I was a freshman in college. The black church tradition is not the problem. The problem is the white churches in America. that have discretionary income. I was a pastor for 10 years in an area of Atlanta where there's more discretionary Christian wealth than any time in the history of the church. But they don't give a damn that there's more black young men who go to prison than go to college. If there was more white young men going to prison than going to college, they would give a damn. So will we ever do the above if we refuse to tell the truth about ourselves to ourselves? In his essay, The Creative Process, Baldwin argues, but the conquest of the physical world is not man's only duty. He's also enjoined to conquer the great wilderness of himself. The role of the artist then precisely is to illuminate the darkness so that we will not in all our doing lose sight of its purpose, which is, after all, to make the world a more human place. I'll end there.